I'm Tom Lux with the Machinist District 751 Labor History Committee. Today is February 27th, 2012, and I'm here talking to Carl Schwartz today. Carl's been a very active person in our union, and we're going to see a little bit about his history today. Welcome, Carl.
Well, welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Why don't we start out by talking a little bit about where you grew up and your family, and were they a union family? And just tell us a little bit about your background.
Okay, I was born and raised in Utica, New York, in central New York, and Utica was a fairly large-sized town, about 100,000 people at that time, and the largest industry was the textile industry. My parents both came from Germany in the 1920s. They met in Utica while going through citizenship classes and married, and I had a sister and a brother. My sister passed away here a couple of years ago, but my brother and I are still active, and he's in Connecticut. I came out to Seattle in 1960 when most of the industry in the Utica area went away. I had worked for Bendix in Utica, and I was involved in the Steelworkers Union, and that plant closed down, and there was really nothing else there. I had first come to Seattle when I was in the Army in 1950. I stayed at Fort Lawton, which I noticed just recently closed. In fact, yesterday I guess it closed. But I then was sent to Alaska. But I did spend some time in Seattle, and I met my wife in Seattle, and we married later. When we lived in Utica, it was always in the back of our mind that maybe someday we'd go back to Seattle. And when all the industry went away, we came out, and I started working a couple places, but then I wound up at Boeing, and I spent actually 34 years working for Boeing. And now I've retired, and I'm active in the Machinist Retiree Club.
So what did your parents do for a living?
Okay, my father worked in a packing house. He was a butcher workman. He was involved in organizing the Union of Butchers in Utica in the 1930s, and one day when I was 7, they had a recognition demonstration in downtown Utica, which my father took me to. So I was 7 years old when I walked my first picket line. And the high point of that to me was I got to ride home on the bus alone because my father stayed longer, and he sent me home. We lived out a ways from downtown. But they did succeed, and my father had a 50-year pin, I think, from the butcher workmen merged with Food and Commercial Workers Union. And so when he retired, he had a fairly, in today's standards, a fairly modest pension from the union, and then also Social Security. So yeah, he was, he was a member. He went, I wouldn't say, he didn't run for office in the union or anything like that, but he paid his dues and was supportive. My mother was a homemaker the whole time.
So what year was it when you came back to Seattle and started working at Boeing?
Well, like I said, I came out here in 1960, and I actually hired in a Boeing in 1962. In fact, I first worked at Rohr Aircraft in Auburn, and I got laid off from there, and that's when I went to Boeing. And I hired in, actually, in quality control, and pretty much my whole career was in that area of quality control, one way or the other.
Were you in quality control at Rohr, too? Or?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. At Rohr, we put the engines, the final assembly of the engines, then they would truck them up to Seattle and put them on the airplane at Boeing Field. Mm-hmm. But I hired in, I worked at Renton most of the time. I did get sent to Auburn for a while, and then the last 3 years I worked in Everett. So most of my career I worked in the Renton plant. I joined the union when I very first came out here. I was been an active member ever since. It just to me, it just seemed natural that you join the union. When I first hired in, Boeing still had a open shop type situation. My guess, just off the top of my head, is that we had at least 80% of the people were in the union, and 10 to 20% were not. So one of the first things that activities that we were in was to try to sign up the other 10 to 20%. And I was involved in that, and I did sign up a few people.
I understand they had some incentives back then if you signed up people.
There was a incentive bonus, $5 a piece for every non-member that you got to join the union. And there were a few people who really went out. I have to admit, I signed up maybe a dozen or so over a period of number of years, but there were people that really went out and signed up a lot of people. But I talked in my own shop, but I didn't make a big deal out of that. But I did start going to union meetings right off. And the first thing that I saw that disappointed me was that I guess you know, they set up the 4 local lodges there. In Local F, they had a hard time getting a quorum, 25 people to the meeting of 6,000 members. And I was disappointed with that. I thought that was kind of bad. The people who were in office at that time were older people. Of course, I was young at that time. And they were good union people, but I would use the term complacent. And as long as they got their 25-member quorum, just barely, they really weren't too excited about it. So I started coming up with ideas. Have coffee at the meetings, my idea. Have a raffle, and bonuses, and a whole number of different attempts to try to be. I thought, number one, that we should have more attendance, and all 4 locals had that same problem. But I think F was probably the worst at that time. So then I talked to a friend of mine, Gene Duran, and he said, "Why don't we run for office?" So here I was a member for 2 years, I think, and Gene also. So we ran for president and vice president, and lost. But did campaign on, we got to increase the membership, we got to get more people, and cause a stir. So a year later, they had another election, and we ran again and won. So I was elected president at a relatively young age and a relatively short membership in the union. And tried to, implement some of the things that, which we did implement some. But then I found that the real decision-making was in the hands of the district council, which I had not run for. So I went another year, and then I ran for president and the district council. And when I was elected to the district council, then we did start making some real changes. And one of the things that the shop stewards, under the contract, in order to protect the stewards from retaliation, because they are the ones that have to disagree with the managers, they have what's called super seniority. And they're the last person to be laid off in the shop. So it was not just me, but a number of us younger people said that if the steward gets this protection in a time where employment is up and then it's down and it's up and it's down, they should be required to attend union meetings.
So you're the one that did that, huh?
And that was
that's a good move.
Very unpopular. However, we did pass it. And I was, these guys were afraid to stand up at the meeting. I was not afraid. I stood up at the meeting and I told them, I said, there's a responsibility, it goes with a job, and there's an obligation. There's a steward in every single area that's represented by our union. So if the steward at least comes to the meeting, then you get an input from every area, and then of course you also have a chance to disseminate to every area. So that's worked out pretty good since.